I'm really glad to be here, and I thank all of you for coming. I'm really excited about this topic. I'm excited to be part of the Marten Conference Series. It's been great, the parts that I've been able to attend this year and in past years. And I think the theme for this year is really exciting. So, in the spirit of a workshop, I would like to speak for about 50 minutes, which would then leave us about 20 to 25 minutes for some conversation. So a workshop, hopefully we can collectively think about some of these issues together. Hopefully my presentation will bring some thoughts to your mind. So Mike Connors asked me to speak about Gaudium et Spes, and he asked me to speak about Gaudium et Spes looking backwards and looking forward. And that was really a providential invitation for me, because I've spent a lot of time in this last year thinking about Gaudium et Spes. I mean, not only are we coming up to the 50th anniversary of its passage and the 50th anniversary of the conclusion of Vatican II, but I've been doing a lot of work on the relationship between Vatican I and Vatican II, which I will not be talking with you about today. But it leads me to think a lot about the intercession between those two councils. And it leads me to think a lot about the development of Vatican II. And the more that I was looking at the development of Vatican II and thinking about Gaudium et Spes' role within the overall goals of Vatican II, the significance of Gaudium et Spes has really been underscored for me. And one insight that I had, which is going to feature in my presentation, is how much Gaudium et Spes influences what comes after the council. How Gaudium et Spes really foreshadows many of the questions that have dominated in the last 50 years. And in particular, in reading about the development of Gaudium et Spes, I was really struck by the similarities between that document and the Synod on the Family. So I want to spend some time in the latter part of my presentation thinking about why the Synod on the Family, how is that appropriate 50 years after Vatican II, how does Gaudium et Spes really anticipate some of those questions. So, there's a million ways you can look at Gaudium et Spes. Hopefully these are interesting, ways that are interesting to you. So, I should have one more disclaimer. I'm usually not a PowerPoint person. I don't do PowerPoint, but I recently have been to so many successful presentations that had great images. So you are my guinea pigs here. On most of my slides are photos, some text. I try to keep the text to a minimum. So we'll see how it goes. Now, so my presentation is going to have three parts. The first part is going to be a quick overview of some of the broad strokes of Vatican II. I hope that's not a repeat for people. If it is, you can never see enough pictures of John the 23rd. So hopefully you'll forgive me if you know some of those. Then I will talk a little bit about the development of this actual text. And the last section will be how Gaudium et Spes influenced the trajectory out of the council. All right, so beginning with a few basics. A simple but accurate definition of a council is that it's a gathering of bishops that make decisions that are binding on the whole church, okay? So the purpose of a council is generally to promote unity, okay? It's to safeguard and promote unity. But when we look at the history of councils, generally councils have been called in times of emergency or times of threat. I like to borrow the phrase from Tom Clancy that usually councils are called in periods of clear and present danger, okay? So, normally in the history of the 21 ecumenical councils of the church, councils are quite defensive. They take on what we can say at Notre Dame, the Heisman mentality of the church, which is the world is scary and threatening, so we're going to try to separate ourselves from the world by emphasizing our clarity and our stability and what makes us different from the world oftentimes, okay? So oftentimes councils are held in this defensive mode where they seek to have precision and to be timeless and clear. Now, oops, I told you I'm not a PowerPoint person. The climax of that mode is really Vatican I. This is the only mention of Vatican I today. So Vatican I is the climax of this kind of fortress mentality of the church, where Vatican I is very threatened by the world. It's threatened by the Enlightenment. It's threatened by the rise of science. So the church is feeling very defensive at this moment, and it tries to respond by showing that it can provide stability and reliability and clarity. So what does it do? It proclaims that the Pope can teach without error. Kind of a highlight of this defensive mode. So for the rest of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, much of Catholic theology and Catholic ecclesiology is characterized by this perfect society model where the church lives with clarity and order and precision and is very different than the world. All right. But then, in the middle of the 20th century, something significant happens. Pius XII had been the Pope for a long time. He was Pope for 19 years. Pius XII was known for being sort of somewhat a rigid Pope who liked the model of clarity and stability. But again, I always try to tell my students, if you think about it, if the pattern in the church's history is that when the world is scary and threatening, that the church tries to look very ordered and clear, World War II and the time during the papacy of Pius XII fits that model very clearly. So in some ways, it's not just unique to Pius XII, he fits into a larger pattern. So Pius XII dies in 1958, and this is not me being gossipy, this is recorded in the diaries of the cardinals. The cardinals decide we need a breather. We need to slow down the church. We've had this long, very distinctive papacy for 20 years. We need time to think, what's the direction the church is going to go next? So let's elect someone who's not going to rock the boat. Let's elect someone who's just going to calmly bless people for a few years while we decide the direction of the church, the next turning point. So they elect Angelo Roncalli, John the 23rd. Now John the 23rd is an older man. He's nearing the end of his career. He comes from a humble background. He's more of a working class person. He was trained as a historian. And John the 23rd, well, Angelo Roncalli was not a mover and a shaker, okay? He obediently served the church where he had been called. So he spent several years in Paris as the papal nuncio, and he also spent considerable time in Istanbul, again, at the behest of the Pope. Now let me tell you, I study ecclesiology. The people on the fast track in the Vatican don't get sent to Istanbul, okay? Or Paris. So, John the 23rd is considered kind of an obedient servant who's going to be this tranquil pope until the cardinals can decide the new direction. Now, what's interesting about John the 23rd then is that unlike most of his fellow Italian cardinals and most of the previous popes, John the 23rd knows what the world looks like outside of Rome. He knows what it is to be in the minority and not just the Catholic majority. That's very significant for his papacy. John the 23rd also witnessed great suffering during World War II. He saw many Jews fleeing persecution during his time in Istanbul. So he was very sensitive to how the church can practically aid and alleviate suffering, and also very sensitive to what had happened to the Jews during the Holocaust. So, John the 23rd, as I mentioned, as a young man had been trained as a historian, okay? So when he's elected, he looks at the world and he looks at the signs of the times. And he decides that the world is at a that the world is at this threshold of a new era in light of World War II, the rising of the Cold War, the move from a more colonial society to a more democratic society. So what John the 23rd wants for his papacy is he wants the church to be a part of the decisions. He wants the church to help inform, be a dialogue partner with the world in this massive transition that's taking place. But he doesn't know how exactly to do that. So he records in his diary that he gets a flash of heavenly light, he'll call a council. Okay? So less than 90 days after John the 23rd is elected, he calls the Second Vatican Council, to the surprise of almost everyone. He did not consult the cardinals in this decision. One thing that I always like to highlight about this is that John the 23rd called Vatican II at a prayer service at the last day commemorating the octave of Christian unity. So in John the 23rd's mind, the cause of unity, the cause of ecumenism, from the very calling of Vatican II are bound up in his vision of that council. All right. So, what I want to highlight now is I just want to highlight how much John the 23rd's vision of Vatican II, since this is a workshop on Gaudium and Spes, I just want to highlight how much for him the council was about reaching out to the world. So in his convocation of Vatican II, he says, it's a question, in fact, of bringing the modern world into contact with the vivifying and perennial energies of the gospel. This supernatural order must also reflect its efficiency in the other order, the temporal one, which on so many occasions is unfortunately, ultimately, the only one that occupies and worries man. Okay? So, I could have had a lot of quotes here. This is the one I chose. From the beginning, when John the 23rd is talking about the council, it's about unity, it's about ecumenism, it's about outreach to the modern world. But John the 23rd sends a request to all the bishops of the world and says, please respond with your ideas of what should be on the council's agenda. That's, for those of you, which I would assume is most of you, who know a lot of things about Vatican II, mostly, oftentimes when councils are called to respond to a clear and present danger, they have a clear agenda. Well, this person is providing a problem, so our agenda is to tell that person why they're wrong, or even just that they're wrong. Vatican II's agenda is much more amorphous because its goal is much more amorphous. Begin a dialogue with the world. So John the 23rd sends out a letter to all the bishops asking them for their opinions about what should be on the agenda of the council. Now it's very interesting because Cardinal Ottaviani and some of the directors of the council from the Curia, they wanted to be a questionnaire. They want to send the bishops a questionnaire, check which boxes you think the council should talk about. But John the 23rd thinks that's too limiting. He wants the bishops to really, on their own, say what they want to discuss. Now, there are, I wrote this down so I could tell you, 2,150 vota returned. Okay? The vota are very diverse. Joseph Kmonchek has a very interesting article on the quality of the vota. They're very diverse. They don't agree on almost anything. One thing they agree on, they want to talk about the role of the bishops because they feel that that Vatican I had emphasized the Pope so much that they needed to talk about the role of the local ordinaries. But for our purposes, what I want to highlight is that almost none of the vota talk about engaging the modern world. Okay? So we have John the 23rd talking and talking about this is what he wants the council to be about. But when the bishops respond, that's not reflected in their letters. So we have this dissonance between these two things. Most of the time, when the bishops talk about the modern world, it's to lament about how bad it is. It's not about, let's engage the modern world. Okay? So, when those 2,100 vota get turned into schemata, I always tell my students, if you can understand that sentence, you've learned a lot in this ecclesiology class. When you can understand that the bishop's voda gets turned into these preparatory documents, there's 70 of them. There's 70 original schema for Vatican II. None of them deal with the church's relationship to the modern world. Okay? So, we go into the actual council without a document that looks like, there's no pre-document that looks like what Gaudium and Spes is going to look like. Gaudium and Spes is the only one of the 16 final documents of Vatican II that doesn't directly come out of one of the original 70 schemata. Now, what scholars say about that, and the bishops who were there say, is because Gaudium et Spes was unimaginable before the event of the council. Before the 2,200 bishops came together to Rome and lived together and ate together and worked together, that it was inconceivable to have this kind of document because there's never been such a document before. So we have these 70 schemata, and some people are very concerned about their quality. They're not that good. They aren't all on important topics. There's no unifying thread relating them. So many people, including Marten, who becomes Paul VI, and Sunins, who we're going to see in a minute, think the council has a grave problem. The documents that we've been given to work on don't look like the vision that John the 23rd has been articulating, and they don't have a unifying thread. So now, Vatican II has, John the 23rd has called the bishops together for the purpose of adornamento, updating, for opening the church's windows. And the bishops are afraid that with these schemata, none of that's actually going to happen. And the church is just going to look like it's incapable of updating, like many of its critics suppose that it is. So, Cardinal Sunins approaches John the 23rd, and he says, I complained to John the 23rd. I love the idea that anybody's complaining to the Pope. I complained to John the 23rd about the number of schemata prepared for discussion at the forthcoming council, which seemed quite excessive. There were, I believe, 72 of them, very uneven in value, and in any case, so overwhelming in volume that a priori they prevented fruitful and worthwhile work at the council itself. John the 23rd asked me to clear the ground and submit to him a plan for the whole council, but that would use, he didn't want the preparatory work to have to be redone. So he wants him to be able to use these 70, but come up with a better overall plan. Now I love this next line. It's my own personal joke that I laugh every time I read. So Sunins sends him a letter. After studying these documents, I sent John the 23rd a preliminary note designed to cut out a lot of dead wood and set the council on a truly pastoral course. And he uses that phrase, dead wood, in John the 23rd. I've cut out the dead wood. I think that's really interesting that he's referring to some of the schemata that way. So, in the worst case, in my mind, of be careful what you wish for, John the 23rd says, oh, you think there's a problem with the order of the council and it needs a plan? Why don't you come up with one, Sunins? Okay? So, now Sunins has to come up with this plan. So Sunins divides the council into this idea that the schema will be organized around the question of the church ad intra and the church ad extra. That's going to provide the ordering paradigm that's going to unite the discussions of the council. What's also very interesting is that if you read Sunins' plan, he uses Matthew 28:19 as the whole plan is ordered according to this pericope. Go therefore, make disciples of all nations, baptize them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teach them to observe all of the commands I gave you. So Sunins is going to use this biblical passage from the end of Matthew as the theological frame for this ad intra, ad extra model. Now, let me go back 1 second. The ad intra topics are kind of obvious. What's Vatican II going to talk about ad intra? Well, it's going to talk about liturgy. There's already been a lot of liturgical reform. It's going to talk about scripture. There's been a lot of biblical study going on. It's going to talk about the bishops and the church, because that's lingering questions after Vatican I. But it's not so clear what are the ad extra topics. Okay? So I think this is very interesting. This is Sunan's suggestion before the council to John the 23rd. Here's the 4 ad extra topics: the church and family society, the church and economic society, the church and civil society, and the church and international society. I think that's very interesting that when we, at least in my mind, and in this discussion I'd be eager to hear what other people think, those wouldn't be the 4 topics that I would presume are the ad extra topics. I have a slide later why he thinks family is number 1, but I'll talk about that when we get to the synod on the family part. So John the 23rd gives a historic radio address just before the opening of Vatican II. And he's asked in the radio address, what is the purpose of the council? What's the purpose? And John the 23rd says, the church must be sought as it is both in its internal structure, its vitality ad extra, in the act of representing above all to its sons the treasures of illuminating faith and of sanctifying grace, regarded in relation to its vitality ad extra in face of the demands and the needs of nations. So we see that he's taking Sunan's suggestion and he's making it basically his own. Sunan's, I should have mentioned this, Sunan's first draft of his plan is about March of 1962, and his final draft is in the late June, early July of 1962. So 2 or 3 months after he gets the final draft, we see John the 23rd embracing Sunan's plan. Okay. Also in John the 23rd's radio address, before the council has really began, he lists fundamental concerns that the council should address: the equality of nations, the defense of the sanctity of marriage, care for underdeveloped countries, disorders of social life, the right to religious freedom, and peace between nations. Now again, why I'm highlighting this is, again, I'm trying to show you that so much of what John the 23rd's vision for the council involves becomes the content of Gaudium et Spes, even though there's no, at this point, schema for that document. Okay, so the night before Vatican II begins, we have this famous candlelight procession. We have the bishops come, gather. We have the famous address, Gaudet Mater Ecclesia, where John the 23rd, who doesn't attend the working sessions for the most part of Vatican II, tells the bishops more about his hope for their work, which includes rejecting those prophets of doom. Okay? So John the 23rd is not going to be in the working sessions of Vatican II, but he wants to signal to the bishops what his own vision is. And a lot of that comes in this historic address, where he has to disagree with those who think the world is getting worse and worse. And instead, it's really the place of Christ's dwelling and Christ's creation. Okay. So, we have the bishops deliberating through the first session of the council. And I'm going to move quickly here, because I want to get to Gaudium et Spes. Sunan's plan doesn't come until 2 months before the council starts. It can't affect any of the documents that the first session bishops are deliberating on. So the first session, the bishops are dissatisfied with the preparatory documents, and they don't think that any of them is good enough to pass. All right? So we have Joseph Ratzinger, I like this young picture of him, says that the great, astonishing, and genuinely positive result of the first session is that no documents passed. This rejection was the truly epic-making character of the council's first session. So, the bishops, but some, I have to remember the order I put it in, but some leaders emerge. Now this is just fun for you and I. We have Yves Congar. we have Cardinal Bea. We have Karl Rahner. So these are leaders that are emerging during this first session. Joseph Edward Skillabakes, John Courtney Murray. Can't not have Godfrey Diekman on there, coming from Collegeville. And we have Archbishop Helder Câmara of Brazil. Now, why I bring him up in particular is that hearing the speeches of the first session where we're talking about these liturgy and Bible and matters about the church, Câmara represents many bishops when he says, are we to spend our entire time discussing internal church problems when over half the world struggles with real issues of hunger and poverty? That's him in a kind of a boxing stance. Okay? So, during this first session, we have a dissatisfaction with the schema. We have a desire from the bishops to get to these issues that John the 23rd wanted to discuss, but they're not discussed. So, the bishops go home in December of 1962. They get ready to come back for the second session, and something tremendously sad happens in that intercession. John the 23rd dies, and we elect Paul VI. Okay? Now, Paul VI, in his opening address of the second session, says that he hopes that the council will shift towards looking towards the more particular and concrete issues, that it will reduce and sharpen the ad extra emphasis of the council. Okay, so now I want to just talk about the development of Gaudium et Spes. So now the bishops are ready to talk about some of these practical, concrete issues of going on in the modern world. And we have some people that would say the church shouldn't be talking about economic issues, and the church shouldn't be talking about the development of nations, because the church doesn't have the authority to talk about those issues. The church is not an expert on economics the same way that it's an expert on ecclesiology. And the most authoritative document is a dogmatic constitution of a council. Can we really talk about politics in a document of that level of authority? Do we have that? Some people are clearly saying, no, we don't. So, the decision is made to divide Gaudium et Spes into two parts. The first part is a more theological framework for the church's relationship to the world. And the second part deals with more practical questions. Questions of economic life, marriage, and family. Originally, part 2 was an appendix. It wasn't an actual official part of the document. So one of the big debates about Gaudium et Spes is what's the relationship between part 1 and part 2? And do part 1 and part 2 have the same level of authority as each other? That's a kind of a contentious issue. Dominic Chenu, the Dominican, says that the purpose of Gaudium et Spes should be to find toothing stones. So a toothing stone is an architectural term. When you build a building and you want to leave space to later on add on to the building, the toothing stones are the bricks that jut out that leave the places for the coming together. So Dominic Chenu says, the purpose of Gaudium et Spes is to find the toothing stones in the world, the areas of common concern where the church could latch on and have a dialogue with the modern world about mutual concerns. Okay. So ultimately, the final version of Gaudium et Spes looks like this. Gaudium et Spes is not trying to be a theological treatise. Most of what Gaudium et Spes is trying to do is make some observations about the world, what it thinks are neutral observations, so that the church can then shed light on what wisdom it has to offer these issues. So it sees itself as starting a dialogue with the world, not finishing it, and not just telling the world some things, but having a neutral observation of what's going on in the world and suggesting ways that the church can contribute to an answer. Okay. The final version of Gaudium et Spes gets promulgated on December 7th, 1965. It's the last document to get promulgated, and by far the longest, which makes sense given what it's trying to do. Now, quickly, I want to move through some of these more quickly. That's the history part. Now, I'm not going to go over all this text, but I want to make a point that's going to show why I think Gaudium et Spes keeps appearing over the last 50 years again and again and again. Okay, so what's at the heart of Gaudium et Spes? I think, and I really am interested in the discussion, I think in the heart of Gaudium et Spes is a vision of what it means to be a human being. Okay? At the heart of Gaudium et Spes is this argument that human beings are spiritual and temporal. They're not just the sum of their parts. They're not just what you can see. That human beings find their wholeness and their meaning and their fulfillment by going beyond themselves towards God, towards their telos, towards their origin and their destiny. What Gaudium et Spes, I think, is saying is that the problem with the modern world, why the modern world feels so alienated and frustrated and homeless and fragmented, is that the modern world tries to cut off this spiritual dimension. The modern world just sees human beings as temporal beings, as economic entities, as as self-contained. So what the modern world is doing is it's cutting human beings off from the reality, the truth that actually provides their meaning, their self-understanding, and therefore they feel very anxious and fragmented and alone. So what Gaudium et Spes, this is from the first part, early in it. I don't want to look at the whole thing, but I want to look at the beginning and I want to look at the end. It says the dichotomy, the polarization affecting the modern world is in fact a symptom of the deeper dichotomy that is rooted in humanity itself. Humanity, it is the meeting point of many conflicting forces. As created beings, people are subject to many limitations, but they feel unlimited in their desires and their sense of being destined for a higher life. Okay, well, I just jumped to the end. So human beings feel divided, and the result of it is a host of discords in social life. And then I think this last sentence really gets at it. What Gaudium et Spes says is the difficulty of the modern world is that there's a painstaking search for a better material world without a parallel spiritual advancement. Now, quickly. So Gaudium et Spes, number 12 says, but what is humanity? And here, Joseph Ratzinger says, the hinge of the discussion between the church and the modern world was man's full development as man. I just kept his gender-exclusive language. Further, he said, the whole pastoral constitution might therefore be described in this light as a discussion between the church and the unbeliever on the question of who and what man really is. So, Gaudium et Spes is saying that the church and the modern world could have a more harmonious relationship, and it believes the modern world could be more fulfilled and more productive and happier if it would realize the true nature of men and women as spiritual and temporal. I have another great quote. Oh wait, these are quickly two quotes from Gaudium et Spes. The human person, though made of body and soul, is a unity. In itself, in its very bodily condition, it synthesizes the elements of the modern world, which through it are thus brought to their highest perfection and are enabled to raise their voice in spontaneous praise of the Creator. For by their power to know themselves in the depths of their being, they rise above the universe of mere objects. When they are drawn to think about their real selves, they turn to those deep recesses of their being, where God who probes the human heart awaits them, and where they themselves decide their own destiny in the sight of God. So when they recognize in themselves a spiritual and a mortal soul, this is not an illusion, a product of the imagination, to be explained solely in terms of physical or social causes. On the contrary, they have grasped the profound truth of the matter. Okay, one more quote. This one's from Colberg. This is him in his commentary on Gaudium et Spes in the Vocation commentaries. Because Christianity concerns man, it has, taken all in all, the same material to work on and the same goal as the world, to make man's future a success. But there is something which transcends the merely earthly. This is what the Pastoral Constitution understands as man's integral vocation. And this something declares its presence even on the plane of observable facts. Thus, humanity proves to be religious, just as religion proved to be human. Okay? So, Gaudium et Spes, in all of its discussions of the modern world and of marriage and family and economics, at its core is this argument that the problems plaguing the modern world are caused in part by the division of human persons and recognizing them only as temporal. Okay? Now, this is going to be very quick. I think that's what John Paul II, very big theme in John Paul II's idea of the culture of death versus the culture of life. If we look at the part that I bolded, the eclipse of the sense of God and of man, typical of a social and cultural climate dominated by secularism, which, with its ubiquitous tentacles, succeeds at times in putting Christian communities themselves to the test. Those who allow themselves to be influenced by this climate easily fall into a sad and vicious cycle. When the sense of God is lost, there is also a tendency to lose the sense of man, of his dignity and his life. So, all I'm highlighting here is that out of Gaudium et Spes, many of the major themes of the last 50 years come directly from this core idea that I think is, it's not invented by Gaudium et Spes. Obviously, it's an ancient Christian idea, but this idea of that this is the nexus of the relationship between the church and the modern world. We also see it in Benedict's discussion of relativism. I mean, when Benedict, his very large concern is that we cut ourselves off from truth because we reject the idea of a supernatural, of a telos. Okay? So, that was very, I just want to highlight those points, but I really want to focus on this synod on the family. Okay? So, one thing that I think is interesting about the synod on the family is that we see many of the same themes as Gaudium et Spes. Many of the themes that get introduced at Gaudium et Spes but not worked out, we see being worked out a little bit more in Francis's idea for the synod. Another thing that I think is really interesting is that both John Paul II and Francis chose as a theme of their first synod the issue of the family. Okay? The first time they gathered the bishops, both of them, they choose this topic of the family. I think that it's interesting that John Paul II, coming out of this communist background, and Bergoglio, coming out of some of the challenges of the Latin American context, both of them recognize, how I worded this, they saw clearly from their own perspectives how the Christian ideas of Christian marriage and family are vital for the transmission of faith. Okay? And the stability of society. So they don't want to just defend the teachings on the family, they want to promote them because they think it's an attractive way of dealing with the situations of the modern world in the changing context. I also think it's important that if you look at the papers of Paul VI, he also wanted to call a synod on the family, but he felt he couldn't because of some of the backlash of Humanae Vitae made that not a providential choice. But I think that's interesting. So, I want to just point out, let's go back to, so what are Sunan's 4 suggestions? If you want to talk ad extra. So Sunan suggests that the 4 ad extra topics are, number 1, the church and family society. And what he says about that, this is his rationale. The church should carry Christ to the world. This world has its own problems, as in an anguished quest for solutions to them, and is in anguished quest for solutions to them. Some of these problems are obstacles to the spread of truth and grace. What do men look for? That's his answer. I didn't write, that's not mine. He wrote that. Answer. They look for love in the bosom of their families, daily bread for themselves and their families, peace within and peace between the nations. These are basic aspirations. Can the church bring them anything on these different levels? Okay? Now, if you look at Francis's rationale for calling a synod on the family, in some ways they're remarkably similar. Francis says, the church's proclamation on the family finds its foundation in the life and preaching of Jesus, who lived and grew up in the family of Nazareth. And then he says, in every age and in the many different cultures, the teaching of the pastors has been clear, and there has been concrete testimony of believers in very diverse circumstances who have lived the gospel of the family as an inestimable gift for their life and their children. The commitment of the Extraordinary Synod is inspired and sustained by the desire to communicate this message with greater incisiveness, in the hope that the treasure of revelation entrusted to the church more and more fills the hearts of each person. I emphasize this because I think it's interesting how much preaching and the importance of preaching comes across in this notion of the Synod on the Family. It's the focus of the Synod on the Family is not just what are the concerns of the family and how can we deal with them, but if you read the documents, they're very geared to the specific issue of preaching effectively to the family and what that looks like. So I was really surprised and thought it was providential to go along with our conference. Okay, so just a few slides on some of the documents connected. So the purpose is to collect the bishop's experiences and proposals in proclaiming and living the gospel of family in a credible manner. Again, I put this again because it's highlighting the idea of the importance of preaching. The mission of preaching the gospel to all creation, entrusted directly by the Lord to his disciples, has continued in the church throughout history. The social and spiritual crisis, so evident in today's world, is becoming a pastoral challenge in the church's evangelizing mission concerning the family, the vital building block of society, and the ecclesial community. Never before has proclaiming the gospel on the family in this context been more urgent or necessary. I'm not going to go over these quotes. My point is that in the preparatory document for the Synod on the Family, Vatican II is quoted 6 times. 5 of them are to Gaudium et Spes, and 1 is to Dei Verbum. So there's a very clear connection, and that's, I will foreshadow for you, one of the questions I'd like to discuss at the end, or in just a few moments, is I keep hearing regularly people say something along the lines of, Vatican II is over, and now we're in the age of Francis. They try to say, we don't want to hear all this talk about Vatican II. We're done talking about Vatican II. Let's talk about Francis. And I think that Francis is very explicitly not making that kind of a dichotomy. But I'd be interested to hear if you hear that kind of a thing. And if people are saying such a thing, what's the difference they're making between the two? So we'll get to that in a moment. So if you look at the questionnaire that was circulated to the bishops prior to the Extraordinary Synod, there were 9 groups of questions. I'm not going to read them to you. They're here. So all the bishops were asked to submit those 9 areas had about 4 questions each. A few samples, these are just samples. In those cases where the church's teaching is known, they mean the teaching on the family. Is it fully accepted, or are there difficulties putting it into practice? If so, what are they? What critical situations in the family today can obstruct a person's encounter with Christ? Could a simplification of canonical practice in recognizing the declaration of nullity of the marriage bond provide a positive contribution to solving the problems of persons involved? If yes, what form would they take? What pastoral attention can be given to people who have chosen to live in same-sex unions? So, when the bishops received all of these letters back when the Vatican received the letters back from the bishops about what they wanted to talk about, they broke up the discussion of the synod into 3 sections. Again, I think number 1, for our purposes, is really interesting, and not necessarily to be taken for granted. Number 1, how can the gospel of the family be preached in the present day? How can the church's pastoral care program for the family better respond to the new challenges of today? How can the church assist parents in developing a mentality to openness to life and in upbringing their children? Now, what we see, I'm just going to spend 2 or 3 minutes talking about a little of the summary of what the bishop said, and then I want to open it up for some conversation. What the bishop said about what are the problems contributing to the lack of reception of the church on the family. I find these documents to be very readable and very interesting. So I highly encourage people to take a look at them. And reading them with students or parishioners, they're quite accessible. And they're quite engaging. One of the issues that they raised is that they feel that the clergy has not done, the bishops say that the clergy has not done an adequate job of having the teachings that exist take a foothold in the lives on the diocesan and parish level. So basically what the bishops convey is that they believe that it's not that the teachings don't exist, it's just that they're not well known enough, and that when they are preached effectively, that people respond to them and embrace them. So there are a majority of bishops who seem to say that what we have is a presentation problem. We've got the teachings. The problem is they're not well known and they're not taught effectively. Then we have a minority of bishops who wonder, do we have a content problem? Is there some of our teachings that actually need to change and adapt? And they want to know, is the synod going to be about content, or is the synod going to be about presentation? I think that's also a very interesting question. The second point that I saw very frequently in the bishop's responses is the idea that the culture, again, and perhaps they're using this word because Francis likes it so much, we need to have a culture of encounter with Christ to make the teachings make sense. You can't have teachings that don't have a climate that helps the teachings look real, make sense, take root in people's lives. I have one quote on here I wanted to share. What is needed is an authentic Christian experience, namely an encounter with Christ on a personal and communal level, for which there is no doctrinal presentation that can substitute. So, what we see in the bishop's responses is questions about content, questions about presentation, and questions about community or environment that make the teachings exciting and connect with people's lives. Okay, so these are the questions I came up with. Again, in spirit of a workshop, I want to have everyone be with each other. So the first question is just a very general, how can we do this thing of preaching the gospel of the family? The second question is the one that I raised about people saying, I literally have had people say to me, more times than, I'm not just making this up, say, stop, we don't want to hear you give a talk about Vatican II anymore. We want to talk about Francis. Vatican II is, we've kind of exhausted that. Now we're in this age of Francis. The third question is, are questions regarding the family really the particularly urgent issues in the church today? Or are there other issues, more pressing question mark, that warrant the bishop's attention? One small anecdote I'll tell you is that my husband Sean and I were in Germany about 3 weeks ago, and we were sitting at a table with about 6 or 7 priests from India, a couple priests from Africa, 3 priests from Germany. And the priest from Africa said, one of the other priests at the table asked the African priest, what do you think about the Synod on the Family? And specifically asked him, what do you think about the question, focusing on the question of divorced and remarried people? And literally the quote that this priest said was, for me, the church is scratching where it doesn't itch. He said, your questions are not my questions. Those aren't my questions about divorced and remarried Catholics is not in my diocese the most pressing issue. And even questions of the family are not where I would put my energy for the church. And then the last question I had, which kind of relates to the first question, is, does the familiarity of family life make it an easy and or effective topic for preaching? Or does it make this a difficult topic to preach on? So we have about 20 minutes left. Would it be possible to maybe start with 5 minutes of talking among in smaller groups and then bring it to the bigger group? I think sometimes that works well. So we take 5 minutes and pick a question that might be interesting to you to talk with a neighbor, and then we'll have about 10 or 15 minutes of a group discussion. Okay?